Now, clearly the PhD or the DPhil supervisor is crucially important to the success of your doctorate, although perhaps less so now than in the past, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But in my experience of having a responsibility for doctoral students over the past 15 years, the relationship with a supervisor is also one of the issues that has proved to be most challenging and has given rise to most anxiety and concern. And this is one of the reasons for my leading sessions such as this one today. We could call it working with your supervisor, and that would also be accurate. But sometimes I prefer the title managing your supervisor, since it's also a management task for you. And one of my goals is to try to empower doctoral students, insofar as this is possible, to discuss expectations, rights, responsibilities, and to try to help you to negotiate a productive and fruitful relationship. In a way, what I'm saying is to suggest that you play an active rather than a passive role in your relationship with your supervisor, and that, I hope, will help you to make a fruitful and productive relationship. As I'll discuss later, the relationship is two-way. You play your part, and your supervisor plays theirs. I went round briefly before and discovered that quite a lot of you are first years. Is that right? Can you put up your hands if you're first years? Second years? Third years? Fourth years? Anyone else? Great. It's never too late to manage the relationship with your supervisor. But for people who are in their first year, and in my own department I will usually do a session like this in week 2, it's very, very important that you work on that relationship right from the start. For people in their second, third and fourth, it's never too late to look at that relationship. If it's got any room for improvement, never too late to look at that. So first of all, the relationship. I've put just there 3 quotes. The relationship is so crucial that students cannot afford to leave it to chance. A good relationship between student and supervisor needs work by both parties. It isn't your supervisor's responsibility to make everything all right. It's up to both of you to work together. And a good relationship is one that is developed actively, and this requires determination, commitment and patience. It takes time and effort to build strong relationships. So my first message is it's a relationship like any other relationships, and it needs work. However, the relationship between student and supervisor is a relationship both like and unlike any other. Like other relationships, it needs work, negotiation, openness, communication, trust, honesty and information. And really, I think I would want to emphasize communication, trust and honesty. It's really important that you can find a way of establishing that with your supervisor. We're all human, supervisors. I'm human, you're human. So we all know about the ways of developing relationships. However, importantly, it's unlike many other relationships, since it has an intrinsic power imbalance, which may affect that it works the way that it works and develops. So we can't pretend that we're all equal, that we all have the same status, that we all have the same role that we have in other relationships, particularly with our friends. There is this power imbalance. And it's this power imbalance, I think, which makes it quite a complicated relationship, or potentially complicated relationship, because ultimately the supervisor has many roles. He or she is your teacher, but ultimately he or she also is involved in assessment, not in the final examination, but in the assessment and evaluation of your progress. But I would like also to suggest that this relationship can be hugely rewarding and mutually beneficial and you have a really important part to play in making it so. So it's worth taking time. Think about that relationship, whether you're at the start of your MPhil, DPhil, or whether it's later on. And obviously, your relationship will be affected by all sorts of things, by your personality and that of your supervisor, preferences, habits, goals, culture, huge cultural differences in the way that supervisors and students relate to each other. Worth thinking about that, possibly even talking about that. Gender, expectations, previous experiences, your previous experiences of teaching, learning, maybe being supervised, certainly your supervisor's previous experiences of doing the PhD. They will all make a difference. And the context of the supervisory situation. One very strong difference in supervisory situation, of course, is whether we're working in the lab or in the library. So science-based subjects have a very, very different supervisory culture, supervisory practices than, say, arts-based subjects, where a lot of the work is one-to-one and study done in the library. If you think about your supervisor, there are various metaphors that you could use. And in some of my work with students, I've got students to discuss these metaphors and think which one most matches the way that they think about their relationship with their supervisor. The point I'd like to make here is that there are many different roles that your supervisor plays, many different roles that you play, and also that these change over time. So that you could start off with teacher-pupil, expert-novice, mentor-apprentice, and then by the end of the DPhil, you could very well be senior colleague, junior colleague, or even colleague-colleague. It's worth thinking about these important questions. These are very useful at the start of your MPhil, DPhil, but again, never too late to think about them. Remember, this is one of the most precious and valuable times of your life. You're investing considerable time, 2, 3, 4 years. You're also investing considerable resources, maybe even your personal funds, but you're certainly investing time and resources. This is a really, really precious time of your life, and you need to make sure that it works for you. So you don't have the time to waste with an unproductive relationship with your supervisor. So think about, what do you expect from your supervisor, and what does he or she expect from you? What role do you expect her to play? How will you get the best out of your supervisor, and how will the supervisor get the best out of you? What can you do to make sure the relationship works well? What kind of student are you, and what kind of a scholar or teacher is your supervisor? It's really worth thinking about those kinds of questions. Ask them yourself privately, share them with your colleagues, perhaps ask them with your supervisor. How are you going to work together? It's really important that, particularly at the start of your relationship, but also later on, that you think about time management, frequency of meetings, turnaround times for written work, mode of communication. How do you learn best? Are you an early bird or a night owl? I'm an early bird, and really I like to do my supervisions 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock in the morning. If I have a student who doesn't get up till midday, that's a slight challenge, but good to be clear about this. And I recommend strongly that you review the working relationship as part of your progress review. We have the GSS forms, the termly review forms online, graduate supervision system. And that's an opportunity for you to review your progress. Your supervisor reviews your progress. But personally, I very much like to do that jointly, face to face, review progress, but also review what I call process, review the process of supervision. And in that way, you're helping yourself to clarify your expectations and your supervisor's expectations. You say to your supervisor, well, things didn't work quite so well this term as I had hoped. Why was that? Is there something that I could have done differently, I, the supervisor, could have done differently to help you? So that you're continually reviewing your progress and the process as you go along. Expectations are continued. Students vary hugely in the amount of direction, guidance that they want or they need. And typically that changes over the course of the MPhil, DPhil period. But it's a good idea to discuss that with your supervisor, because it's not a given. Sometimes I say to students, you mustn't be a victim of the role which a supervisor wishes to impose on you. You have choices, and it's up to you to help to make this relationship, to make this process work for you. Written work. What kind of written work? Is your supervisor okay with early drafts? I talk about the dangers of perfectionism, because for me, perfectionism is also a very helpful, useful delaying tactic. I haven't quite got it good enough. I can't hand it in yet. It's not quite good enough. And I'm afraid I will say to students, I'm sure it's good enough now, please hand it in tomorrow. And I would say write often. And when I say write often, I'm thinking of every day. Even if it's just a little paragraph, the more you write, the more practiced you become, and the more confidence and authority you will have when you write the final thesis. So it's really important, write often, possibly a lot of time for yourself, but also write regularly for your supervisor, get the benefits of feedback. And, as I say, clarify with your supervisor whether early drafts are okay, whether later drafts are preferable, but please don't aim for perfectionism, I suggest. Milestones and timetable, who's in charge? It's a good idea to clarify that. If you expect your supervisor to be in charge of letting you know that it's time to hand in your submission for transfer of status, make sure that your supervisor knows that you're expecting it. In my experience, it's quite a good idea for you to take charge of your timetable. And what I recommend with first year MPhil or DPhil students is do make your 2-year or your 3-year or your 4-year plan. Do say, here is day 1, here is Viva examination, and here are the milestones in between, so that you keep a track, discuss that regularly with your supervisor. But the most important thing is to clarify who is in charge. What do students expect from their supervisors? Well, you can probably tell me as well as I can tell you. And if we were in a different mode of presentation, I would ask you what you expect from your supervisors. But I'm sure that these are some of the things that you would expect. Genuine interest, an approach that adapts, attention, constructive and timely feedback, relationships that are friendly but not too informal, clear and supportive communication, and respect. I think we all need respect. What supervisors expect from their students? Responsiveness to supervision. And obviously there are different forms of responsiveness and different ways of taking on board feedback. But I think one of the most irritating things for supervisors is to have feedback just ignored, not taken on board at all. Absolutely fine to disagree with feedback comments. That's great. That's part of academic dialogue, moving forward boundaries of knowledge. But unwise to ignore feedback, even if it's puzzling, unpalatable, and so on. Supervisors expect students to submit written text on time and as agreed. For myself, I like to have this text a few days before our meeting so that I can read it thoroughly and prepare for the meeting. Again, check with your supervisor what they want. For myself, I like to see students regularly, once a fortnight, and possibly even once a week in the first year. Get a lot of writing, get a lot of ideas flowing, progress on at that stage. And ideally, every fortnight have a short piece of written text on which I can give some feedback. Attendance at meetings is agreed. Good idea to be on time, but some supervisors care more about that than others. Critical engagement with the research, initiative, communication, and again, respect. Now, communicating with your supervisor is important, stating the obvious, but it's really important that you keep your supervisor informed about what's going on. Don't have to have the full details of your personal life, but any personal issues that are affecting your work, particularly any absences. If you're going to be away for 2 weeks or going off on field work or whatever, really important to keep your supervisor in the loop. If I were talking to supervisors, I'd also say the same to them. Really important to keep your students in the loop as to when you're in Oxford, when you're away. But we're not talking to supervisors at the moment. I think it's a good idea to communicate with your supervisor any thoughts about supervision, but that takes confidence. If there are things that are really, really bugging you or irritating you, it's a really good idea to find ways to discuss those with your supervisor, because it could well be that it's very easy to change. And it's a good idea to share with your supervisor any ideas you have for the future, discuss your career plans, any conferences that you think you'd like to go to, internships and so on. Partly your supervisor is going to be a very, very relevant source of references, recommendations and so on. So it's a very good idea to keep that regular communication. Many students go away from Oxford for considerable periods for fieldwork. If that is the case, then I strongly recommend that you maintain the communication by email, possible in most parts. And it's a really good idea to keep up that communication. Think about some practicalities. Firstly, how do you address your supervisor? Maybe professor, maybe doctor, maybe first name, but somehow you've got to sort it out. And it may change. It may be professor somebody in the first term, and then gradually as you get to know each other better. Good idea to sort that out. And again, there are cultural differences. I have 2 students who I've worked with for 4 years. They've completed, and they've never called me Ingrid. Even though I sign every email with Ingrid, they are always culturally Professor Lunt students. So just work that out. And it doesn't matter. Just work out what's comfortable. It's always useful to have a record of meetings. Every single meeting. Who keeps these? I recommend that the student keeps the record. What I do with my own students is ask them to email me straight after the meeting a short note of what we discussed, what we agreed, who's doing what, and the date of the next meeting. That record can be very brief, bullet points, but it's extremely important. It's very important, I think, for the process of supervision, but it's also extremely important, for example, if in the unlikely event that something went wrong and you needed to go back over the record to see what actually happened. I think it's usually helpful to arrange the next meeting at the end of one supervision. So, at the end of the supervision, okay, when are we next going to meet? Fortnight's time. Because it's much easier to cancel that meeting than to pull it together at short notice. And also, it gives a sort of purpose and a direction and a progress in the process of supervision. It's an excellent idea if you come to the meeting with an agenda. It's your meeting, it's your precious time, it's also the supervisor's precious time, but it's your meeting and it's your time. And it helps to ensure that you get what you want and what you need from that supervision. So I think an agenda, just a list of points that you want to discuss, so that you make sure that both that you've prepared for the meeting and that you make sure that you cover in the meeting everything that you hoped for. Because that is particularly important, but not only important, it's particularly important if you have long gaps between meetings. You really need to make sure that you make maximum use of that precious hour, or whatever it is. If your supervisor needs you to confirm the meeting, make sure you know how to do that. But particularly, try to avoid cancelling at last minute. I mean, obviously things happen, and have a clear cancellation arrangement. As I've said already, try to build in the review of your supervision alongside your termly review of progress. And keep in mind your 2, 3, 4-year plan and the relevant milestones. So those are some of the practical aspects. I should say that some universities make these supervision records mandatory, and they require formal records. We don't here. We don't do a lot of formal mandatory procedures in relation to supervision. Some of you may find it helpful to do that. Again, it's a matter of preference and what suits you and your supervisor best. But I do recommend strongly record keeping and agenda setting. Rights and responsibilities. Clearly, as a student, you have a lot of rights and a lot of responsibilities, both as a student of the university and as a human being. And your supervisor also has rights and responsibilities as a member of faculty and as a human being. I think it's useful to go through understanding of rights and responsibilities with my students. What do you think your rights are? What do you think your responsibilities are? And so on. But for the purposes of today, I think it's important to be aware that you have considerable rights. And one of the rights is not to suffer in silence. So if you have challenging situation in relation to your PhD or supervision and so on, one of your rights is certainly not to suffer in silence, and I strongly recommend that you don't do that, and that you take an active approach, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Some universities, some students, some supervisors have found that a contract, written agreement or memos of understanding are useful. For example, in setting out goals, setting out a timetable, setting out deadlines. Some universities, particularly in the United States, do that, have a mandatory contract. Some universities in this country also do that. We don't here in Oxford. And personally, I wouldn't want to go to that formal length with my own students. But it may be something that you would like to explore. It doesn't have to be a sort of legalistic contract. It may be just a goal-setting contract. The supervisory relationship nowadays frequently involves more than one person, which is why I made that remark right at the start, that 30 years ago you could be completely dependent on one supervisor, whereas now you will have more than one relationship. Co-supervision and supervisory teams are much, much more common now, and indeed are mandatory in most universities. They're mandatory in most universities because of the problems of supervisor availability, absence, moving on, and also to have a more distributed sense of supervision, so that the supervisor relationship is not just a one-to-one, it's more of a team endeavour. As I said earlier, there are disciplinary differences. So if you are a DPhil student in a laboratory setting, you will have relationships with all the other people in the lab, postdocs and so on. Whereas if you're library-based DPhil student, you won't have that team, access to a team so much necessarily. Perhaps almost as important is your cohort of DPhil peers, the people who are around you in your department or your faculty, the people who are engaged in the same process of doing a DPhil as you. Not on exactly the same topic, but the people that you run into in the library, in the department, in the faculty, and so on. Because your colleagues and your peers can play a very, very important role in providing a sounding board, listening to any issues that you have, giving feedback, sharing challenges, and so on. Then there are other academic faculty. So we hope that you will interact with a wide range of academic faculty beyond your supervisor. And I think it's appropriate for you to arrange meetings with other people, to have feedback from other academic faculty, perhaps ask their advice on particular questions. But that does need to be done tactfully, and probably it's a good idea to inform your supervisor that you're doing that. But it's very important that you do engage with other academic faculty, and of course, increasingly, you'll be engaging with a wider community of scholars. Now, what I've been talking about so far is really building a relationship, making sure that relationship is positive, some of the practicalities of the relationship, but my message is, do think about it as a serious relationship. And before we go on to think about things possibly going wrong, I'd like to consider with you a list of difficult issues which have been mentioned by supervisors and students. And this was generated in workshops that I led in my previous university, but will be familiar to all supervisors and all students. So when I've run workshops for supervisors, the difficult issues mentioned by supervisors are, or include, student doesn't provide work, or student doesn't provide work on time. Student doesn't respond to suggestions. Student waits to be told what to do. Student doesn't appear to be making progress. It's difficult to communicate lack of progress and to give negative feedback to student. Student doesn't respond to emails. So I go into the next room and run the workshop with students. And the difficult issues mentioned by students include supervisor doesn't give feedback on work. or enough or timely or clear. Supervisor doesn't have time to see me. Supervisor doesn't tell me what to do. Supervisor tells me what to do, but I want to do something different. Supervisor gets interrupted during sessions. For example, he answers the phone. Difficult to communicate with supervisor over the supervisory relationship. Difficult to communicate with supervisor. Supervisor doesn't respond to emails. So some of those are sort of mirror difficult issues. So what do we do if things go wrong? First of all the things that we've been talking about up to now have aimed to avoid things going wrong. But the most important thing is it's important to talk to someone early on. Do not leave it. If things are going wrong, the time to address them is now, absolutely today. It's absolutely disastrous if in your first year things start to go wrong. You suffer in silence, and then at the end of the third year, you start to talk about it. Those 3 precious years will have been potentially extremely challenging and less productive than you wanted. So it's really important to talk to someone early on. Ideally to talk to your supervisor, or a colleague student, your college advisor, the DGS, Director of Graduate Studies in your department, head of department if the DGS is your supervisor. But most important, talk to someone. Firstly, you get it off your chest, and secondly, that someone can help you to think through what is going wrong, what you might be able to do, and what's the next step. So your time is too precious to waste. Early on is absolutely the best. As I've said earlier, keep good records. Keep a record of every meeting. In the last resort, it may be possible to change your supervisor or add another faculty member to your supervisory team. And again, if the relationship has come to that, and that's rare, but sometimes it does, it's a good idea to address that sooner rather than later and form the new relationship with the new supervisor. So supervisors are not irreplaceable, but this is where the power imbalance can make it very, very difficult. And I'm not underestimating the difficulty of negotiating a change of supervisor. But 2 things I'd like to emphasise. 1 is important to talk early, and 2 is you aren't alone and you mustn't be alone in this. So don't, as I say, suffer in silence. On the other hand, I think that if you've developed those good work habits and worked on that relationship, many of those difficulties can be avoided. But you need to try to avoid being a victim. And a victim is usually a person who is rather passive, allows things to be done to you. So think right from the start of being actively engaged in the relationship, actively engaged in the supervision. Now, all of this DPhil process, supervisory process, and so on, all of it is provided within a framework of quality and what I call protection for you as students. So it's provided within a framework of the university and also by external bodies. The university provides guidance and resources, and then increasingly there are national bodies which provide guidance and requirements. So national bodies visit universities regularly and have a look at how things are. What's the provision for doctoral students? External bodies, for example, the QAA, will visit universities every 5 years and look at arrangements. So there is some, there's a framework and there's some protection, in inverted commas, provided by external bodies. Within the university, you should have access to handbooks and websites and all sorts of guidance. And it's a good idea to familiarise yourself with that guidance. For example, the Memorandum of Guidance for Research Students and Supervisors tells you what are your responsibilities. Quite a good idea to take a quick look at that. And it may be something that you want to look at when you're negotiating your relationship with the supervisor. The University Education Committee provides policy and guidance on research degrees, and that's the university framework. And that's currently being revised, and OUSU are involved in the consultation for the revision of that document. But basically what we're trying to do there, or what the university is trying to do there, is to make sure that supervisors are qualified and competent. They know about supervision. New supervisors are mentored and inducted. I think very important that there's a normal maxima of students. If your supervisor takes on 1 or 2 new students a year, they're more likely to be able to give them the time, attention and support needed than if they take on 5 or 6 new students a year. And then you think if you 5 or 6 multiplied by 3 means that 3 years means that the supervisor is looking after 15 or 20 students. So we try to look at normal maxima. Minimum number of formal supervisory contacts that might be expected. If you haven't talked to your supervisor about that, I recommend that you do in your next supervisory meeting. Talk about how regularly, how frequent you can expect meetings. And in a way, without, I think I haven't used the word entitlement yet in this presentation, but I would like to use it there and to suggest that you are entitled to regular supervisory sessions. That's part of your rights as a student. It's always difficult, I think, to quantify what that is. I try to quantify it. I try to say to my own students, I think, other things being equal, it's useful for us to meet every 2 weeks. And then sometimes students are away on field work, or I'm away on conferences or something. But on average, I think it's a good idea to meet every 2 weeks. And increasingly, the university is required to provide skills training. Excellent resource internally, website provided by the Oxford Learning Institute. Now that's a resource mainly for supervisors, so it's www.learning.ox.uk/supervision. It's mainly for supervisors, but it's absolutely excellent, I think, also for research students, especially the section which is headed Stages of the Doctorate. Again, in there you'll find thoughts about getting started, clarifying expectations, defining your research topic, reading and writing, transfer and confirmation. So I recommend that you have a look at that website. Very briefly, external codes and guidance. There is a new Quality Assurance Agency code published this year. Headline sentence: the research-student supervisor relationship is of paramount importance in all research degrees. But the importance of that code is really that it's the framework that universities need to follow in making provision for research students. And there are increasingly other external bodies who provide guidance and expectations. So research councils, and nowadays research councils are increasingly organising their research training through doctoral training centres. But the research councils are having quite a strong influence on research training, the process of the DPhil and so on. Higher Education Funding Council, which is the body which funds universities. United Kingdom Council for Graduate Education has, I think, a very useful document called Quality and Standards of Postgraduate Education. And then if we look beyond UK, European research universities have a useful document, Doctoral Degrees Beyond 2010. Because I think that one of the things that you will be doing in your MPhil or your DPhil is both becoming an expert, and you will be a world expert by the day of your viva. So you're becoming an expert in your chosen topic, but you're also becoming a competent researcher, and you're gaining a huge number of other skills that we hope will equip you for life beyond the doctorate. So what the doctorate is doing is one, enabling you to develop expertise in your chosen subject, but two, is training you to be, we hope, a top-rate researcher. Finally, if you were really interested, there are some quite good books that you might find it useful to dip into. And I've put those there, and they will be on the website. And what I'd like to say now is best of luck. Do negotiate a really productive relationship with your supervisor. And I'd love it if you've got any questions on this presentation. Thanks.